Um, Hello everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Laura, and tonight is the third event in the What We Talk About When We Talk About Work, which is a series of public discussions with curators and artists based in the north of the UK, as well as invited practitioners from different European cities. So each discussion takes place in a different northern gallery and is being live broadcast by the contemporary art magazine This Is Tomorrow. So for the duration of the event this evening, the discussions will be streamed live on the homepage of This Is Tomorrow and available to view on their archive following the event. So with that in mind, before I say any more, I'd just ask you to make sure your phones are on silent. So what we talk about when we talk about work has developed from an interest in exploring ways for curatorial and artistic practices to work outside, across, between and within existing institutional structures. So generating dialogue between practitioners and sharing and discussing modes of practicing. So each event takes a different theme, and so far these have included rethinking the institution at Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, conversation and exchange talking with children at Blue Coat in Liverpool, and following tonight's event, fictional encounters at the Northern Gallery for Contemporary Art in Sunderland. So each of the talks in the series, like I said, is archived on the website and on This Is Tomorrow, so if you want to watch any of the earlier ones, you can catch up that way. Tonight's event at the Tetley in Leeds takes the theme of movement and dance. So the invited speakers will each present their recent projects and practice in relation to considerations of movement and dance as both a curated form in a gallery context as well as a method of working curatorially. So that is reflecting upon what we might call the choreography of exhibitions as a space and time throughout which artworks exhort and direct an audience's movement. Our first speaker for this evening, Bryony Bond, is the artistic director here at the Tetley, and she will talk about the gallery's interest in working with live and performance-based practices. So over the last year, the Tetley has hosted a week-long intensive residency for performance artists from South Asia and the UK, and exhibited contemporary artists working in performance, including Corinne Swan and Doria Garcia. Following Bryony, we'll be joined via video link from South Korea by Nicola Singh. Nicola is an artist based in Newcastle, but she's currently on a residency in Busan. So Nicola will discuss her recent commission for Jerwood Project Space in London, and then she will also pose a series of questions that reflect her interest in the exhibition as a site of flux. So the artwork as something that is moving and shifting in constant interaction with a given space and its audience. Our third speaker, Michel Van De Velde, is part of the artistic team at Kunsthal Extra City in Antwerp. Michael comes to curating from a background as a trained dancer and choreographer, and he's currently artist in residence at Kai Theater in Brussels until 2021. Mihail will talk about his interest in the potential to challenge practices of exhibition making by thinking of them through a prism of performance. So considering movement, dance, and choreography as modes of exhibition making that can disrupt standard practices of presenting artworks to provide a heightened experience for a viewer. Finally, Maeve Rendell, an artist based in Preston, who works within the different forms of video, dance, and musical composition, will present her practice, and the talks will end this evening with a preview of Maeve's most recent work, The Doers, which will take place throughout the gallery building. You're very welcome to follow the work as it unfolds after tonight's talks. So the format each speaker will talk in turn, and before there will be a discussion and an opportunity for questions at the end of the evening. I'll also introduce each speaker, talking a bit more about what they've been doing recently and their biography. But before we begin, I'd just like to thank everyone that's made tonight's event, as well as the larger series of talks possible. So the team at the Tetley, Raina and James at This Is Tomorrow, and the generous support of Arts Council England, Contemporary Visual Arts Network North West, Yorkshire and Humberside Visual Arts Network, North East Contemporary Visual Arts Network, and the participating venues of MIMA, Northern Gallery of Contemporary Art, Blue Coat, the Grundy, the Tetley, and the Whitworth. So, Bryony, as I said, is Artistic Director of the Tetley. She was previously Curator of Temporary Exhibitions at the Whitworth, Manchester, and has curated shows for National Museums Scotland, Camden Arts Centre, and A Foundation. Her current programme at the Tetley has an active engagement with contemporary performance practices.
It's nice getting introduced at the Tetley. I'm normally doing all the introductions. I'd like to start off by thanking Laura for setting up this network. It's a really nice opportunity to reflect on curatorial practice, but also to kind of think about it in a wider context and hear from practitioners and other curators. So thank you, Laura, for organising it. I'm going to talk this evening a little bit in kind of sections. I'm not going to kind of move chronologically through exhibitions. I'm going to try and talk about them in, I guess, kind of themes or, I guess, concerns to kind of think about when I've been thinking about working with performance and live work here, and a little bit about why. So my first question is, or my first kind of consideration is around context. So, and that's kind of in various forms. So obviously this is a gallery space, but it's a very unusual gallery space. It's originally like the headquarters to Tetley's brewery, so it was office spaces, and as such, the gallery spaces are quite unusual. So in the centre of the gallery, we have a large atrium space, which is open, and I think this evening's performance will really kind of utilise what is sometimes the kind of problem of that space, which is a kind of sound leakage everywhere, so you can hear everything from that space. But it also is a kind of small kind of amphitheatre. So when I started working here, I felt like actually it was a space that really kind of presented itself to actually work with live performance. And in contrast to this central space, surrounding it are these much smaller, kind of domestic scale office spaces, kind of wood panelled, often with fireplaces and bookcases still intact. And I thought that actually these contrasting spaces kind of lent themselves to thinking about performance and the different modes potentially of performance in the gallery space. So one, a quite theatrical space where you might encounter a performance with a kind of audience assembled for it. And in other spaces, you're generally kind of one-on-one with an artwork. So I kind of felt that these spaces really presented an opportunity to kind of shift through different modes of performance and to work with these in different ways. So it's also kind of thinking as well a little bit about Leeds. So Leeds is a really interesting kind of city, and one that I hadn't realised until I started working here, in that actually it has a huge dance community and a huge kind of producing dance community. So there are lots of kind of dance activity happening in the city, and I felt really important somehow to engage with that and actually to kind of think about that in terms of the gallery. I think one of the things that might be interesting to pick up on this evening is also a kind of challenge, I guess, to kind of thinking around performance, in that it's something that's perhaps seen as kind of almost actively encouraged in galleries to kind of take a more performative mode in exhibitions. So it's not always seen as enough to present an object, and that actually there's a kind of impetus in some ways to actually kind of, engage and actually have a kind of live element in some ways. But maybe we can kind of pick up on that in further discussions. The other key question for me is around duration. So when you're working in exhibitions and kind of gallery terms, like duration is, Monday to Friday, 10 till 5, 3 months. You know, it's quite a long prospect. So when we worked with Dora Garcia, and as Zoe in the audience will remember, there was lots of organising of volunteers to actually kind of take part in this show. So we wanted to have a live element for the exhibition anytime you came to see the show. So, and it was a 3-month show, open 7 days a week. So that presented its own particular challenges of kind of actually physically making that happen and trying to kind of make that possible throughout the 3-month duration. So we kind of timetabled things, so there'd be, you know, maybe on a Monday morning there would only be one kind of live work happening, and then perhaps kind of later on a Saturday afternoon we'd have all of the kind of works happening and a theatrical performance. So in each of the gallery spaces upstairs, I think there were 4 kind of performances actually happening in separate spaces as kind of individual one-on-ones. Sorry. And then there were other kind of performances that would be programmed in throughout that week. So within the amphitheatre space, we had a performance that would only happen every Saturday afternoon, and that was very much a kind of theatrical kind of performance. Which is another point I'll kind of come to. Other times when we work with artists, it's for much shorter durations. It is a kind of event-based work. So this was a project that David Steens, which you can't see at all, I apologise for the lighting, our lighting's not working today. David Steens worked on a response to Dora Garcia's exhibition, really responding to ideas around literature that Dora engaged with, and created a performance around crime fiction, but for one evening only. So very clear kind of start and finish times. Okay, my next kind of question is around preparation. And I kind of mean this in 2 forms, both in terms of the artist and in terms of the audience. So in the summer last year, we worked on a project which was part of the new North-South project, where we're working with biennials in South Asia and partners across the North. And we invited 6 artists from South Asia and 6 artists from the UK to come and work together on a workshop. And the workshop was really all around kind of breaking down kind of conceptions around performance, and was really very much about thinking about the body in space, and really kind of challenged, particularly quite a lot of the UK-based artists, kind of considerations around practice. I think quite a lot of the UK artists were really driven a lot by text and by kind of potentially kind of, reading things. And the artists that were leading the workshop were really kind of asking them to kind of consider, how did you enter a space? How do you begin and end a performance? What do you wear? What props do you use? And I think some of the artists initially were saying, I don't use a prop, and I just wear what I'm going to wear. But the whole kind of thing was actually everything that you kind of choose, how you enter the space, what you wear, everything is kind of a part of the experience. And as part of this workshop, they kind of went through a number of exercises. So there was a number of trust exercises, which included this, where one of the central people would close their eyes and then be kind of thrown around the circle, so they'd kind of fall and be caught by other kind of people. And it was quite a game, but it really kind of forged this kind of collaborative spirit between these workshop participants. And they kind of entered into this workshop without presenting their practice. So they felt also very unusual in that regard. So when they turned up for the workshop, there was no kind of, so introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your practice and what you do. They went straight into these kind of physical kind of workshops. And I'm kind of really interested in this kind of preparation kind of phase, both in terms of kind of, like I say, the artist, but also in terms of the audience. So I didn't work on this show, but Marina Abramovich's kind of performances at the Whitworth, included a whole kind of early section around slowing people down. So there was a whole kind of thing about walking slowly, about sipping water very slowly, and kind of essentially kind of getting you into a kind of different speed and time as a participant. And I think when you're working in this mode in a gallery space, thinking about a kind of how to prepare an audience is also kind of a key part of that. And I think in other exhibitions we've talked about kind of small, like kind of antechambers, or the kind of like a kind of space in between that kind of is some sort of kind of preparation space. Again, it's something I'd be interested to kind of pick up on. It's not always possible. And in fact, actually, in the contrast between Dora's exhibition and the workshop that we did with the artist from South Asia, we found that audiences were sometimes quite hesitant to enter the room for Dora's exhibition, because they'd come to see an exhibition and they didn't expect to see someone sat in a chair reading a book at them. And I think they felt a little bit kind of hesitant sometimes about how to engage or not to engage. Did they talk to people or not talk to people? Sorry, I'm going to really kind of not go massively over. Another question is around audience, and again, this kind of participation or not participate. Just as a kind of small example, Dora included in her exhibition a steal this book. So visitors were invited to steal the book, and the invigilators, if they saw someone stealing the book, were meant to say, you need to put that book back. But if they could get away with it, they were invited to steal it. And if they stole it, there was just a label that was left saying, essentially, you've missed it today, the book has already been stolen, you need to come back tomorrow if you'd like to steal this book. Okay, theatre. There's a whole question around theatre in the gallery. I think I was kind of reading Michael Fried's, so I never know how to say it, Art and Objecthood, which kind of says that basically theatre is the enemy, and that, theatricality is kind of... And I think, in kind of present work, theatre is something that's becoming much more embraced, and actually a theatrical kind of element is something that's kind of actively being worked through. So this was a performance by Nikhil Chopra. He started off as a character, as a cotton farmer. Over the duration of 72 hours at the Whitworth, he transformed into a factory worker, and then finally a kind of factory boss. So, characters, performance, a kind of scripted way of working was all part of it. Dance, I'm going to kind of leave this one to Michael, but just in that we worked with Siobhan Davis Dance when I was at the Whitworth, and one of the most interesting experiences was actually a staff workshop that the dance artists led, and it was a kind of workshop across the organisation, and everyone took part, and it totally changed so many things in the organisation. It was a really interesting experience. Risk. This was a work that was really about kind of, singing, dunking himself in water. And I think sometimes when you think about performance art, I think there's a kind of history about risk. And I think quite a lot of more work at the moment is really kind of moving away, I think, from those kind of highly risky practices. Okay, finally, language. I think there's a huge amount of kind of around kind of storytelling and language. So in Dora Garcia's exhibition, a book is read, and it's called All the Stories. And the first phrase is, a man, a woman, recites all the stories of the world in a loud voice. When she has done, all the stories, all men and women, all time and all places will have passed through her lips. And it's just this kind of reading of stories. I think for some artists like Dora, language is actually the key to their work, and a lot of her performance is really around kind of literature and actually the experience of literature. She often kind of refers to the fact that it wasn't until the kind of 19th century that actually people read individually and silently, that actually a lot of kind of reading prior to that was the spoken word, and that was how you experienced stories. I'm going to kind of race through some of this. Political acts. I think there's a whole kind of thing around political acts. I'm just going to kind of quickly touch on some of the artists that took part in the workshop that we did for the New North-South project. Chloe Cooper has a project called Bedfellows and is doing a whole project around sex education, which is a kind of performance and an activist project. Riza Kabir, who did the performance here, also makes work around her body and interpretations of production and using her body within these kind of spaces. And for her, it's very much a political act, basically. Yeah. The empty stage or performance afterlife. I think this is often a kind of situation in galleries, I think, where, you know, sometimes you present a performance and then what you're left with is the kind of aftermath of that performance. And, you know, the kind of sculptures are props and props are sculptures, and these kind of situations become blurred. So you kind of enter the exhibition at a kind of moment afterwards that may occasionally be reactivated. This is an installation by Tai Shani, which is also doubles as a stage and an installation, and she kind of makes no distinction really between those. She thinks, you know, the experience of those sculptural elements is just as valid, as well as kind of the performances that enact them. Okay, I'm going to kind of just briefly kind of finish on humour, if I may. How can I make it work? Okay. How do I do that? No. Sorry. That's not quite as smooth as I was hoping it would be. Okay, yeah. So I just wanted to quickly...
This is performance art. Sir Francis Spalding has been lucky enough in the course of his illustrious career to rub shoulders with some of the key protagonists in performance art history, and has made it his business to preserve for the nation something of the dazzling panoply of the aesthetic wonders contained therein. This is the first in a landmark television series that seeks to instigate a revolutionary model for the assimilation of live art. Today's episode will concentrate on mapping a hitherto uncharted territory. That is the development and extraordinary mainstream proliferation and influence of performed sculpture and dance within contemporary culture, with particular focus on the work of two of its leading proponents. It seems logical to begin our voyage of discovery by considering that most legible of performed sculptural modes, namely ventriloquism. The transition of this cheap vaudeville technique to arch conceptual form is a fine example of the kind of mobility frequently achieved within the genre. Of course, any discussion of the subject must necessarily open with the extraordinarily influential work of Joseph Beuys. The essence of his professionalism amounted to more than the appeal of his rare but irresistible grin, flawless ukulele technique, and heavily accented broken English. From the tip of his battered gray felt hat to the frayed hem of his hopelessly stained fishing jacket, he radiated a kind of sagging melancholy that audiences could relate to. Much is made of his profound understanding of primitive symbolism, and certainly he was much in demand as a session musician. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that throughout his illustrious career, his extraordinary talent for voice throwing would always find its most effective outlet when allied with his considerable animal trading skills. In fact...
Anyway, so that's just a brief film by Mel Brimfield, and Mel kind of like mixes together kind of popular culture, TV from the 70s, together with kind of high art, and these kind of like modes of performance that we kind of keep entirely separate, she kind of completely smashes together. And I think, you know, it's actually, there's something really valid, I think, said about both forms through this kind of smashing together. But there you go. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bryony. So our next presentation is from Nicola Singh. Nicola's practice is rooted in performance, so she produces multifaceted projects, often involving readings, experimental music, dialogue with other artists, and the production of performative installations and objects. Nicola also works as an arts educator in gallery and community settings, exploring ideas of performance, discursive and physical approaches to pedagogy and research. She holds a practice-based PhD in fine art titled On the Thesis by Performance, a feminist research method for the practice-based PhD. Her projects include a new performance for Lux and Lux Scotland at Glasgow Film Theatre, and a commission from Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art to create a new performance for their Family Day event. So Nicola has sent this film, which, where is it? Should play.
Hi, this is Nicola Singh. Sorry I can't be with you there in person today. Big thank you to Laura for the invitation and for facilitating this kind of remote presentation. I'm going to improvise through this. I thought it might cut through some of the awkwardness of not being there with you in person. I'm going to present a recent project of mine called Sweet Spot. It was shown at Jowood Visual Arts in London last year, November, December, and it was commissioned by Jowood in London, by Workplace Gallery in Gateshead, and by Eastside Projects in Birmingham. So it's the first part of a kind of three-part commission. I chose this project because it seems the most provocative example of my recent work that deals with movement and dance in the area of making exhibitions through performance. So I'm going to show you a few extracts of the work, describe a bit about the process, and end with a few questions, kind of open questions to myself and to you guys. I'm going to have to be quite snappy, so apologies for the kind of swiftness. So I'll show a bit of film to kick things off and then describe the process. Okay, so I'm just going to carry on letting the film play as I talk. I guess broadly, within my practice, I prioritise ideas of making exhibitions through performance, or have variously used language such as a kind of a performed or a workshopped exhibition, or showing performance as an exhibition in a kind of expanded sense or a suspended sense. For this particular project, I wanted to make an exhibition that was kind of born of a performance or a performative series of moments, and that also kind of felt like a platform for something else live to take place. So the process began with a workshop in Newcastle, which I organised with 4 other women artists, so Kate Sweeney, Deborah Bauer, Naomi Garrick and Tessa Cleaver. The workshop focused on kind of finding or feeling or moving outside of the body or outside of the usual capacity of the body, or finding representations outside of the usual or the dominant representations of the body. There was an exercise which was inspired by skin and releasing technique and some of the practices of kind of embodied movement, and also writing practices of Deborah Hay. So for that exercise, we kind of wrote alongside moving, and that was initiated by a performance text that I wrote and delivered to the group. We also went through this practice, which the film documents, of drawing around ourselves. A lot of my work is a kind of excuse for or occasion for kind of intimate negotiations of body, quite often working with women and in the company of other women. So past the point of this workshop, I went on to produce a large-scale textile installation, particularly from this practice of drawing around our bodies. So we were drawing on an organza silk with dressmaker's crayon. I went on to paint round those forms with wax, so referencing a practice of batik, and then dyeing the fabric. Install is really key to me, and I think is an interesting kind of moment for performative moment in terms of exhibition making as a performer. I feel really strongly about letting the work meet the space and the space meet the work, and not really relying on any kind of modes of gallery display. So really trying to work with what's already present in a space rather than bringing anything in. It's important to me to be in that space for as much as possible prior to install, and to kind of really take my time. In terms of install, I like to think about it as kind of like prowling the space and the work to see what energies arise or rhythms when you bring certain objects into certain spaces. So this was the work installed in the gallery. You can also hopefully see some kind of props that were installed around the textile work, some handles, a bolster, a kind of steel bar that I designed and had made. These were, or would go on to be used in the performance, and were also kind of objects that spoke to this idea that something else was going to happen in the space, and that thing that was going to happen was going to be physical. So I wanted there to be a kind of tension in this space, so things were kind of unsettled and not quite finished. The other element of the show was an audio piece that was playing through the speakers. That audio was me reading through the text that I presented to the group in the initial workshops of this text that was related to kind of skin and releasing technique or guided meditation. So it was a piece of writing that kind of spoke to the body, but in a kind of expanded body. The next stage of the project was a performance that happened in the installation. So this was with Harriet Lewis and Jenny Moore. It was an improvised performance. I brought together some lyrics that were born from the initial workshop again, and offered the lyrics to Harriet and Jenny. We spent 2 afternoons in the installation together, I guess a bit like the way that I described the process of installation, kind of getting to know the space, getting to know the installation, kind of resting in the energy of that and one another. And really did speak to Jenny and Harriet about the idea of kind of hanging out in the space and being with one another in the space, and how that was then going to inform a practice of improvisation rather than it being some kind of like structured rehearsal process. So also made some costumes that kind of spoke back to the aesthetic of the installation. And these photos are from a kind of warm-up, and then also from the live thing. One of my hopes, particularly with this work that I spoke to the other women about, was the idea of reactions, like real reactions. So sometimes in performance I think that things can get sticky or dulled down in the presence of an audience in terms of genuine reaction. So I was really wanting to get to feel real with that. So if Jenny or if Harriet did something that surprised me or made me laugh, I would be able to be with that emotion and present it in front of an audience. And you can kind of, I'll play you the audio, I feel like you can kind of hear some of that in the work. So post this performance, which is kind of halfway through the exhibition, then the audio of that performance that you just listened to then replaced the initial audio work. So the exhibition was kind of always changing, never finished, never settled. And that again is a kind of a key thing for me in terms of exhibition making, or this idea of what does performance bring to ideas of exhibition making. It's this idea of when is something finished or complete, or is it ever. And I guess what I hope is kind of clear about this project is that it had the body or the moving body as the kind of dominant driving aesthetic or energy at all its kind of points in its making, which meant that when the work was kind of just an exhibition, so when it was a series of objects in the space, they felt kind of buzzy or alive, that they were imbued with something. And again, that was another like hope of mine with making exhibitions, is that objects don't feel flat or static. They like they feel of people or of experience or for more experience. And then I guess just broadly with some questions to end with, I'm interested in how performance can act as a kind of provocation for the visual arts or for exhibition making, particularly how it can challenge ideas of aesthetics. So when something is more process-based and about human experience and exchange rather than kind of a visual outcome of something. So what does performance mean for aesthetics in a gallery space? What does it mean for modes of production, so how things are made? And also particularly what it means for ideas of duration in relation to performance and exhibition, so ideas of a kind of expanded duration or suspended duration. I'm interested in what it means for organisations to be exhibiting performance. What does it mean for curators? What does it mean for the artists? What does it mean in terms of fees, contracts? And yeah, so I'll just put some of that out there and hope there's a way for me to kind of beam in with you guys in a bit and take part in some conversations. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Michel Van De Velde. Michael studied dance and choreography at Parts in Brussels. He is active as a choreographer, curator, writer and editor. He's a member of the artistic team of Kunsthal Extra City in Antwerp and Batard, a festival for emerging artists and thinkers in Brussels. He's also part of the editorial team of Etc., Performing Arts magazine, and involved in the Disagree magazine. From 2017 to 2021, Michael will be artist in residence at Kai Theater in Brussels. And in his work, he investigates the elements that constitute or obstruct the contemporary public sphere. And he's been developing a variety of projects, both in public space and in performing arts institutions.
So, hello everyone. I hope you can understand me. Otherwise, you wave. So yeah, I studied dance and choreography, and I only recently entered the sphere of exhibition making. I was appointed together with two colleagues of mine at Extra City for a period of 3 years. Now, today's topic, dance and movement, or choreography, performance in the museum. It's something that is close to me, though I'm also a little bit skeptical about the whole issue. I had the honor to have a workshop with Tino Segal when I was studying at Parts, and so we spent 1 month with him together. And I think Tino has been quite important for the shift in performance. So before Tino, you had already a lot of performing arts within the museum, but it was more kind of one night or one kind of action, or it could be a week. But it was what he radically changed was this idea that you had performances during the exhibition hours for an X amount of weeks or days. And so this really grew out of a kind of institutional critique, also his ideas about contemporary economy, which is knowledge-based, non-material, and so on. After him, there were a lot of artists that followed, a lot of choreographers also, Xavier Leroy, Boris Schermatz, Alexandra Pirizzi, and they all do great work, yet I think there is not the fundamental critique from which Tino Segal's work actually emerged. So after him, he opened this possibility for dance to enter in a different way the museum, yet it didn't really provoke anything anymore in the museum, I would say. And so what I will talk about is, because I'm interested still in how my background with how can you employ choreographic tools within exhibition making without necessarily employing live performance within the exhibition. So how can you use knowledge from another field to kind of open up the way of making exhibitions today? And so I will talk about first two experiences of works which I was not a curator of, or I was also not involved. And then I will speak a little bit about an exhibition I'm preparing now for 23rd of March, which will open then. So this is Extra City, the space, the art space where I work for. It's an old industrial building, well, I guess similar to this area, though this is quite a clean building. This is a very rough industrial building. Just to give an idea, Briony mentioned the importance of space, and this is really a space you have to deal with when thinking about exhibitions, not a given wide cube space. So this is already one element, but I will talk about it later. Now, let me think. So, space, there was this work, maybe you've seen it, of Hanna Lippert, which was at the KW in Berlin. It was half a year ago, or almost a year ago. Hanna Lippert, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She's working a lot with sound, but sometimes also creates more architectural spaces. And so you have these stairs in the central pavilion of, or the central space of KW, and then you go up the stairs and there you enter this space where there is a sound installation. So you are allowed to go up the stairs every 20 minutes. So the sound installation is 20 minutes. So for me this is an interesting example of an artwork that's kind of, in a very soft way, without falling into the trap of participation, choreographs its visitors. So there is a clear duration, there is a clear time slot, and so you're invited to walk up. You cannot enter when the installation is happening. You have to wait in. And so when you enter upstairs, you enter this kind of space that gives some kind of theatrical experience. Even it was, when I was there, it was quite warm. You have this soft carpet, which is pinkish, and then you have kind of outdoor view, which you don't see really here on the building surrounding KW, and you listen to a kind of sound installation going on. And I think for me this was quite an important work to encounter in relation to thinking about choreographing the experience of the visitors. Then another work is, which I briefly wanted to mention here, is a work of Martin Spanberg. It's a choreographer. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. This work was Natten. It was a 7-hour or longer performance, which happened from 11 in the night till the next morning. And so you would be able to enter and exit the space, and there would be this very long performance going on. I saw it in Brussels in an old chapel. Now, he has this notion of expanded choreography, which I think is interesting in relation to thinking about the exhibition. Expanded choreography, what does this mean? This means that the choreography is not only written with dance or movements, but includes also the writing of sound, of light, of scent, if you want, of the objects in the space. So it means that you look at the situation as a whole. And so I think this is quite interesting to take, or what I thought was interesting, to take this notion of what would be expanded choreography within exhibition making. For example, you have this problem here also, you have a lot of sound constantly. Also when you visit the art space upstairs, we have it at Extra City also, there is a bar, which annoys me a lot, because it's kind of another economy entering the economy of the museum. Yet, I mean, it's there, so you have to deal with it. Often it's kind of ignored, or it's there, but it's not really taken into account. But how can this really become part of the conception of making the exhibition? It's kind of everyday sound entering the exhibition, which is often quite a different world, let's say, or showing different worlds at the same time. So how, in that sense, I mean expanded choreography within exhibition making. All these elements that you take for granted, how can they become part of it? Space, but also sounds. Also something interesting with his work, he shows his work in gallery contexts sometimes, but mostly he would avoid it also, and show his work more within theatrical spaces. This has also to do with conditions. The conditions of galleries are very poor. There are no dressing rooms. Payments are very different often. So there is also this whole, I think the previous, I forgot her name now, in the end posed the question also around these conditions. Now, maybe just one thing, sorry, I'm just adding points here. One thing to add also, I'm a bit critical of performance within exhibition making. I think there is a very uncritical audience within visual arts towards performance. Often when I see performances within exhibitions, I find them very bad, and they're very badly done, and they would never survive on a stage. And so these different levels we have in judgment for performances we see in performing arts venues or in galleries always strike me. So I think there's still a lot to be learned within contemporary art circles about the quality of work. So kind of uncritical audience. I was showing recently myself a work in progress in a gallery, and I was very comfortable or not nervous at all, because I thought they will anyway applaud very enthusiastically, which was also the case if the work is very shitty or not. So it's a useful context to try out stuff, whatever you want. But I think that's not so positive. And also something I forgot to add in the beginning is, the main problem, the main thing for me, or how I understand it, why there is so much interest for performance and dance nowadays within gallery contexts, and Brianni also touched about this, is the problem of spectatorship today. So we have the tendency, or there are these statistics that we look 12 seconds or less to a painting or to an object, whereas suddenly when there is a performer in front of us, we are there for hours, and we spend a lot of time in the museum. And so this says something about our attention span, about how we look to images, how we need liveness or kind of excitement of liveness in order to be attracted to stay within the gallery. So we can discuss more about this later also. Now, I'm preparing this exhibition at this point, Eating Each Other, which is on the dynamics of reappropriation and starts from a kind of critique of Western liberalism, which claims to have an openness, yet is extremely close towards otherness, be it newcomers and their traditions, but also people who are critical of liberalism as such. And so in the exhibition, what I try to do is kind of perform the dynamics of appropriation and reappropriation, which is also a dynamics of power. And so one artist I invited is Pieter Jan Ginkels. And what is interesting in his work is that, and that's might be interesting in relation to the discussion here also, is that he while making a work, so even before the display of the work, he performs a certain character. So in this work, he will perform a kind of, or over-identify with this kind of Western heterosexual man and kind of symbols of the Western sphere here. I mean, the work is called No Peaks, and he does this solar safari, looking into all these configurations of solar panels, and in installation there will also be these solar panels, but in very cheap materials, and then there will be a kind of rebuilt Lamborghini in wood. But so there will be all these different elements. Here is a kind of sketch. I mean, this is not finished, but this is part of installation. There will be this, how do you call this? Trampoline, that's how you say it, where people can also jump on during the exhibition. This is really a very rough state of the artwork. It's not finished at all in his atelier, but he kind of over-identifies with Western culture in a way. And so I think that's for me interesting in relation to think about performance in relation to exhibition making, is how are the artists themselves also performing their roles even before the exhibition opened. And so he's quite a clear example of someone who does that. In contrast, and then that's some other strategy I'm employing in the exhibition, in contrast or in kind of juxtaposition to the work of Pieter Jan Ginkels, there will be this work of Arkady Zaides, which is an Israeli choreographer, who documented a part of the border between Europe and on the other side there's Turkey, and photographed it. And so there is kind of in a program they trace the borders of Europe. And so this is this strategy of juxtaposition, which is for me a kind of performative strategy. You have at the one hand the work of Pieter Jan Ginkels, which is kind of over-identifying with Western popular culture, and at the other side you have the limits of this culture being represented within this artwork of Arkady Zaides. I show these two examples to explain. So there is a performativity of the artist, but there is also the performativity between the objects that are on display in the exhibition. And so for me, these are also in a way choreographic strategies, juxtaposition between different objects, where the choreography in a certain sense is a mental choreography happening in the heads of the visitors. Now, part of this exhibition there will be also a work of Radouan Rezija, who is a Moroccan choreographer, and this will be a work in progress during the exhibition. He will be there sometimes during the exhibition, but at unannounced times. So he will not be there from every day during the opening hours, but he will pop up now and then and develop in one of the spaces, appropriate one of the spaces and develop a work there. And so for me, this is interesting as a kind of, if the strategy of using live performance within exhibition places is often used to attract wider audiences. This for me plays a little bit with this idea of kind of disrupting this idea of attracting wider audiences, because you never know when he will be there. So you might be there at the exhibition, but he might not be there, and you would see what he has created before within the space. But you might also be lucky and he might be working on the installation while you're there. So this is kind of playing with performance within the exhibition, but not entirely giving everything on a platter or something. And then the last work, which there will be much more works part of this exhibition, is this work of Ermias Kiflesis, which is an Ethiopian artist. And this work is kind of developed through, one could say, a performance which happens outside of the exhibition space. So he has this practice of putting, now they are disappearing, but you had these old telephone cabins, but also these shops where you would be able to call to countries far away. How do you call these kind of shops? Phone call shops or something. And so people, he would put their papers or pictures, and people would be drawing on these papers or pictures. And he would then interfere sometimes and draw other stuff on it. And so there he would, through this kind of practice, he would develop this artwork, which would then finally end up in the museum. And so this is for me also another example of a strategy where performance and art making comes together in a work, not in the museum, but actually outside of the museum, but then the trace is becoming visible within the museum. So just to finish, I'm sorry, I'm a bit maybe giving a lecture in different points. Just to finish, the exhibition Eating Each Other, when the exhibition is almost over half of its duration, so it will be 3 months, after 1 month and a half, it will be appropriated again by 2 other curators. So this is by Aneta Rostakowsko and Jakub Janorowski, 2 Polish artist curators who have this practice gonzo curating, which is a kind of idea of subjective curating. And they will appropriate the exhibition, put under the existing exhibition a different title under the existing title, so, and different name plates and so on. And so you will get a kind of double exhibition where you don't know which one is the artwork and which exhibition is the original exhibition. Also kind of making the existing artworks into a fiction, or the existing exhibition into a fiction. And so they play very much with this notion of fiction, with kind of the narrative, or the different narratives that could be told with the same kind of exhibition, which for me in the end turns up as a kind of other way of a performative practice within exhibition making. So voilà, that's a little bit what I wanted to speak about. Of course, we can speak much more in the talk, and I mean that's a nicer format to address issues. Thank you.
So next is Maeve Rendell. Maeve works with video and performance, and she compares the experience of a scripted work to that of an artwork enacting a real-time task. She uses video to preserve unfolding moments, illustrative of effort in a performance, and she uses the discipline of the performer to help reveal unintentional truths. Her recent projects include the solo exhibitions I Remember All at Harris Museum and Art Gallery Preston, Gabriel's Greta's Gabriel at the International 3 Salford, and Unframe at the Grande Art Gallery in Blackpool. She was nominated for the Paul Hamlin Foundation Award for Visual Arts in 2014 and for the Northern Art Prize in 2008. In July this year, she'll be making a performance and solo presentation of What Cannot Be Turned Aside at Contemporary Forward in Rochdale.
Thank you, Laura. Hello. So I think when I was asked to speak tonight, thinking about the way that I work and thinking about the theme of kind of movement and dance, I think the first thing that I thought about was the most sort of surprising moment when I think movement just kind of popped up in my work. So I've put together a bit of a slideshow of a few really short video clips of about a minute or so each. But I thought I'd start with this image, which is quite an old work. It's probably quite difficult to see, actually. But it's maybe 10 years old now. But essentially, I made sculpture and installation for a long time. And what I realised in my kind of practice of making sculpture, I was actually just spending hours on end undoing kind of objects and undoing things in space. And in that undoing and not wanting to kind of miss things that were just incidentally kind of happening, I photographed pretty obsessively kind of anything that I was working on, and then very quickly realised that the photographs were far more interesting than the finished object, and then realised that actually I don't ever kind of finish an object. I hadn't ever been trying to produce a finished form as such. So this kind of process-driven way of working was there from the start. So there's a series of images, about 100 images, which are just the kind of standard photograph size 6x4, I think. And I always used to work just with a kind of a manual Pentax camera that was breaking itself, but never tried to fix it, just worked within these kind of settings that the camera was stuck in. And so any image that I created, I didn't have any control over. So this sequence of images was called Litany, and it is a light bulb that's in a bedroom in one of my houses, I think when I was still a student. But essentially kind of looking at this object and then thinking, okay, I'm going to string up a cotton grid, so you'll be able to see slightly around the light bulbs. All there is in the room was a cotton grid strung from corner to corner, just surrounding this light bulb, so the light bulb sat in the middle of the cube, and the only purpose of the grid was so that when I took photographs of the light bulb, I had nothing to kind of, or no decisions to make, so I lined up the kind of horizon line in my camera with the line of the grid and just tried to follow through as many different combinations of that grid as possible. And so the surprising moment of movement that I'm talking about is when I went to Happy Snaps, I think it was, to pick up my film that had just been developed, and then kind of looking at these series of images where it's just one light bulb that's being photographed over and over again, and all of a sudden it's kind of got this incredible kind of rhythm and movement across a sequence of, I think it was something like 96 photographs. So that was the first time that I kind of really thought about movement within my work, and naturally this is a work from 2014. I began to realise that the material that I was using, or physical material, or painting, making sculpture, making these installations in a space and producing a finished form wasn't quite enough anymore, and that the way that I'd started to think about the human body, and I'd like to say now as well that actually I don't perform myself, but I work with anyone I can get to perform for me. So I started to think about the human figure really in terms of how we think and the sounds that we make, the sounds that our bodies make naturally, and language, and all of these things being a material, and the kind of human body, or the way we think and the way we experience things as material that I could still treat in the same way. I could still kind of undo it and see what might happen. So I'll just play this video. Can I? Oh no, it should be all right. Oh yeah, that's right. Sorry.
I was a dog. I yawned. Its tears flowed. I could feel these flowing. I was a tree and I yawned to my blanket and made it stir. I could feel them flowing. I was a tree. I was down and started to sometimes I felt 85 pages of text, 300 illustrations, including the portraits. Sometimes I felt my bones, I let them go. My parchment flesh smelled of food. I shut my ears as a hungry way to slow down. Thinking, singing, thundering, inserting myself
no reason to live. I wasn't
To dive to oneself into the earth and to contemplate impossible ideas from the depths of the
The world was a prey of evil. Only one salvation. To die to oneself and to the earth. And to contemplate impossible ideas from the depths of the ship.
And to contemplate impossible ideas from the depth of a ship.
These butterflies would be none other than myself. Me, 25 volumes, 18,000 pages of text, and 300 illustrations, including a portrait of me. My bones,
to die to oneself and to the earth.
So yeah, I wanted to show that work. It's pretty difficult to see without the lights going down. But that was a basement space. So I think a couple of things happened all at once in 2014 for me. I realised that, well, I had this idea after moving house myself and kind of stumbling upon a copy of The Words by Jean-Paul Sartre in a charity shop down the road, and a book that I read from cover to cover with great ease and found some really standout moments which just kind of really beautifully kind of, I suppose, putting observations, very kind of everyday observations in an incredible light. And this was an autobiography of the first 9 years of his life. So I found this kind of book and realised that I really want to do something with this, and that all the material that I need is right here, but it's just a case of thinking what else do I need to employ to make the work. So a friend of mine ran a series of exhibitions in a townhouse in Salford called Black was the space. So it's a basement space of this townhouse, and so it provided like the perfect opportunity really to try this piece of work out. So the only material that I needed, as I said, was this book, which had 13 sections underlined all the way from start to finish, the end of the book. And then I got in touch with as many different reading groups in Manchester until somebody kind of cottoned onto it and thought they'd like to be involved, and managed to get 9 readers. So people that they meet as a book group quite often and kind of spend a lot of time in each other's companies and really enjoy that kind of experience of reading. But with that piece, again, it was a little bit difficult to see, but what happened is they stood in the basement space for about an hour and a half, and they stood each with the same copy of the same book with the same sections highlighted throughout it, and they stood in silence until a person walked down the basement steps into the basement. And that was a trigger for all of the performers or readers to open the book and page by page, starting from the beginning, just leaf through each page until they found a section highlighted, and as soon as they found it, they read it out loud. So that was their job. So essentially from this point on, I kind of started working in a way of all of those routines or maybe rituals that I employed when I was photographing objects. I then kind of started thinking, well, how can I do a similar thing but use people instead? So the most kind of interesting things about that piece of work in the basement, as well as the movement that they created, because after a period of time, the tendency when a lot of people are reading together at the same time is to shout or just get louder to be heard, to hear yourself better. But we talked about it, and what happened after a while was that everybody started to kind of back off and turn to different spaces. So a lot of performers stood and faced the wall and read quietly to themselves. So I was thinking a lot about that. How do you just hear yourself above the noise, really? And that's kind of fed into a lot of other works where I'm thinking about this idea of the internal voice. And even if I find a book like that and I read those words and somehow it chimes with me so much that it feels like it's somebody talking about my life, and that all of those people could have a similar experience. But reading those words for the very first time and then going in repeat, so kind of read them again and again, and every time they got back to the same section, it meaning something slightly different to them, and they expressed it slightly different each time. So moving on from that, I'll try and speed up a little bit, but I was invited to create a piece of work for an art fair in Brussels, actually, called Propositions. I don't know if you... and that, again, this is going to be quite hard to see, I think. So a group of us from Manchester were invited to go to Brussels, and when I went to Brussels, at the time, there were a lot of art fairs kind of happening, and I'd been thinking about a way of... I wanted to do something that would kind of respond critically to the way that art fairs encourage or just make viewers view art and how different it is from an experience of an exhibition. And that idea of kind of lots of people en masse moving through spaces and glimpsing and glancing pieces of work, and it's the works that catch the eye that would perhaps get more interest. And it's not to say that on the whole, everybody kind of at art fairs, they don't look at art. It's not that at all. It's just that experience of so many things kind of happening in such a short space of time and then being gone. So and at the time, again, with this, I tend to take inspiration for works or get ideas a lot from sort of literature and theatre as well. So this piece of work, I was thinking at the time, well, I just started working with some singers, and I managed to make contact with an opera singer, a soprano in Ghent at the time. And ultimately, I asked her if she would be willing to be my kind of artwork for the art fair. So again, the job became, at the time, I was thinking about Samuel Beckett's play Happy Days. And so I wanted this opera singer to kind of assume the character of the lead role in the play Happy Days.
so, yes, she was given the task of kind of wandering around the art fair, dressed kind of in black and white and with a big black duffel bag, kind of looking like a collector, and that any time she was approached by gallerists or artists to trying to sort of draw her in, thinking that she might be a collector, that she'd only speak in a few phrases that were taken from the play Happy Days. So she would just stand and say to somebody, oh, happy days, this will be a happy day, and sort of sounded a little bit mad. So again, from this work, I started to become very much more interested in how the audience respond. So I'll just play this. Cursor. So she did a couple of things really, because what happened is she was wandering around. She just started singing the Merry Widow Waltz, which is an incredibly beautiful song and also kind of very popular and well known. So immediately, because the art fair was over 3 floors, I think. So it did get to the point where when she started singing, there was an incredible amount of movement, like people flocking to the spot where she was singing. But then the other side of it was that she was always on a timer. So in her hand, she'd have a mobile phone, and it would only allow her something like 3.5 minutes, and then it would ring really horribly loud. You couldn't quite hear it there, and she'd just cut and stop immediately and then carry on and not really talk to anyone and just keep looking at the artworks. So yeah, it worked in a couple of ways, and I found it really interesting, all of the way that she could kind of create quite a lot of interest in a second, and also this idea of how people then gather around that person and nobody kind of went to the front of her. There are a couple of incidents when people, or one man in particular, would just stood really close to her, but the idea of them looking at her as opposed to looking at the artwork, and up until that point they'd been kind of really kind of running around looking at things, and then this managed to kind of get everybody to stop and listen. So I'll just move on to this piece quickly. So then the other thing that I was thinking about in terms of movement, and I'm kind of leaving dance aside at the moment, but there's a piece that I'll get to that perhaps enters that sphere. So everything that I've done when I've worked with people, again, is always about kind of setting something up in the moment, so that nothing is really rehearsed. There are always kind of very simple rules, and maybe there are some fixed elements to the piece of work. But ultimately, I think of my job as, I suppose, creating the environment, the space, and selecting certain kind of elements that I know together will either jar or hopefully do something quite interesting. But in terms of knowing, again, this idea of the finished product or the final outcome, I never really want to control that. So I'm always kind of balancing between controlling certain elements that I know will do something, but then leaving the actual kind of outcome to the performers or the people that are involved. So this is an actress called Nicola Ferguson from Manchester. And essentially I asked her to learn off by heart a short monologue from a Chekhov play called The Seagull, which, without going into too much detail, on paper when I read it, this short monologue was really it blew me away. It was really incredible. And I kind of imagined that when I see this in the theatre setting, that this monologue is going to be delivered in a really dramatic and kind of heart-stopping way. And I did go and see it, I think, at the National Theatre. And I hadn't realised to that point that actually this monologue, Chekhov used it as a device in the play to kind of... because it's kind of warning about really the end of the world, I suppose, or how humanity is just not really paying attention, but it's used in the play to only enforce that. So when the actress delivers the lines, she does it in a very kind of quick, and it's just, the words are just kind of lost. And she deliberately is making a show of not really being interested in these words and reflecting, I suppose, society and this idea of a society or kind of groups of people being more interested in gossip than anything kind of too serious. So Nicola, I found her because she did actually play the part in her first year at Manchester Theatre School. So I asked her just to learn that monologue again, but when she would come to the studio to recite it in front of the camera, that she'd be reciting it just as herself, not as the part played in the play. And I also told her that something would disrupt her throughout the course of her delivery, and that she would just keep reciting this monologue on repeat until I kind of gave her the signal to stop.
No longer do the cranes awake and call in the meadows, and no May beetles may be heard in the lime groves. It is cold, 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 empty, 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 terrible, terrible, terrible. The bodies of living creatures have been turned to dust, and eternal matter has converted them into stones, water, clouds. But their souls have been fused into a single whole. The world spirit am I. Within me are the souls of Alexander the Great, of Caesar, Shakespeare, Napoleon, and the most miserable each. In me, the thoughts of men are mingled with the instincts of animals. I remember all, and I relive anew in my own being every other life.
Unbeknownst to her, at the back of the studio, 16 sopranos were hidden away. So when she started or was ready to recite the lines to camera, there was a pause of about 5 minutes or more when all of the sopranos kind of came out and she could see them, but she wasn't able to react to them. So I deliberately kind of wanted to put her in a position where she was already focused and in sort of character, but then wouldn't be able to kind of not respond to what was happening around her. So the idea of movement in this piece, I think, for me, was certainly that the kind of the role that the actress in front of the camera reciting the lines, and then the 16 sopranos just using that chorus line from Lou Reed, completely kind of improvised the back and forth between them, and how she had to readjust her position several times to either, again, as they got louder, to shout over them or to adopt different ways of working, and also just trying to hide all of the stress or everything that was happening, all of that expression, trying to hide it from coming across. And at times, like, she almost sort of laughed halfway through that. There were at points where she made mistakes, or her breathing, you can hear her breathing change because of the way that the sopranos are singing. So that kind of back and forth became kind of really interesting. Okay, and then this is the last one, which is silent, so I'll just play it. So this probably maybe, I think, for me, almost refers back to the beginning, the image at the very beginning. So this is a ballet dancer that I asked if I could film her. And again, with this piece of work, the only thing I really wanted was for the ballerina to tie her hair up in a bun, kind of as tightly as she could, and then to start to pirouette in front of the camera. And I asked her so every time she took a turn, so it's not even really a full pirouette, but just one turn, that she'd do it in such a way that she'd be trying to kind of loosen the bun from her head. And the idea was that she'd continue to pirouette until her hair comes completely loose. And this is something, again, like, I suppose I've put it here at the end because a lot of the works, well, everything that I've shown so far with performers, I don't ever really consider them to be absolutely bound by those performers that have made the work. So the Sartre piece, the reading in the basement, I've performed that maybe 3 or 4 times with different people each time. And the idea with this work is that it's ongoing, and that I keep, wherever I am, I'm trying to kind of find dancers that will do this same movement. And so I guess what I find myself in now is that every kind of work that I make, I feel that they're kind of part of a much larger composition. So these start to become a kind of a language of their own. And I think the works will, again, I can sort of position them next to each other to create a kind of another work itself. I think that's probably about it. I've got finished yet. Okay, great.
Come and have a seat. So we'll just have like a short discussion, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. I will attempt to WhatsApp Nicola. To take this. I will just contact Nicola.
She will join.
Yeah. On the phone. Okay. Hello? Hi. Okay. I'll just start the discussion, and then if you want to say something, yeah, just speak and I'll hold you to the mic. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, thank you all. I feel like a lot has been said, and a lot of very different sort of perspectives have been given. Like on the one hand, there's been a discussion of almost curating like traditional performance in the gallery space, then thinking of curating like contemporary art based performance, and then thinking of staging performance, or also the sort of afterlife of the performance and the trace of the performance, as well as working with both traditional dance practices and using those tools within a more contemporary art setting. But something I sort of wanted to ask about or pick up on was something you said in your presentation, Bryony, where you referenced Michael Fried and his critique of theatricality. And within that critique, he says something that how everything within your field of vision, everything within the audience's field of vision when they walk in a space counts. And so when you look at the minimalist sculpture, you are also looking at the bodies in the space and the scale of the work in relation to the scale of the interior. And like these are things that he was critiquing, but I think actually they're things that reflect perhaps Michael's discussion of this idea of expanded choreography. And so what I wanted to pick up on, even though we're talking about movement, is actually stillness, and the stillness of the object-based work rather than the kind of the eventfulness of the live happening, like the stillness of that inviting the potential for performative encounter. So thinking about the audience and their invitation within a space that is still or not moving to be a space of potential event, if that makes sense.
I'd kind of say, I think someone once described curating as actually exactly that, is about thinking about how people encounter a space, and actually really considering that is kind of really about the practice of curating. And I guess I've kind of, I certainly kind of think about it in the way that I kind of think about curating is really about that entire experience. And, you know, it kind of starts, you know, before you even walk through the front door. It's kind of, the whole kind of experience is really, a choreography of visitors, as I think you kind of termed it. So there's a certain kind of consideration, I think, in all kind of curatorial practice about how you kind of, everything, is a kind of part of that choreographer of visitors. But I'm kind of really interested in that, because, as you say, like, that's a kind of critique in that kind of seminal text around theatricality. And he kind of, you know, Fried actually kind of says something like, the success, even the survival of the arts, has come increasingly to depend on their ability to defeat theatre. So it's kind of actually, I think, you know, we kind of think very differently, I think, about that in terms of actually, I think we think more theatrically rather than kind of assuming that actually the object is somehow kind of alone and therefore kind of able to kind of communicate itself. We kind of assume actually that the whole kind of experience is much more complex. And, you know, I think, you know, the idea about these kind of theatrical settings, when you were talking, I was actually thinking about a show at the Barbican a couple of years ago, which was called, I think, The Bride and the Bachelors. I don't know if you ever saw this, but it was a show of Rauschenberg, Cage, Cunningham, I can't remember who else, but and it was curated actually by Philippe Perreno, and he actually created like this whole kind of scenography. So lights would come on, lights would go off, music would come on, you know, and it was actually a kind of like, you know, so lighting on the artworks would kind of come on and off. So the whole thing was like a completely, like, very theatrical experience around kind of moving people around the space. You know, and then, you know, recorded sounds or actually kind of live sounds from underneath the Barbican would be kind of brought into the space. So it was very much about kind of really making this, you know, these very kind of static, although according to Fried, quite theatrical works, a much more kind of whole kind of theatrical experience. So that maybe kind of touches on some of those points. I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, first of all, theatrical seems to imply, or I think there is I don't know the critique of this person, but theatrical seems to imply what I would call something dramatic, because theatrical is not necessarily dramatic, if you understand me well. I mean, okay, because it can be a very minimalist approach to theatricality, I think. So I don't.
That's his problem.
Yeah.
He kind of takes a very minimal approach. Oh, sorry.
Okay. But then I was visiting now in the Tate, the Modigliani exhibition, which is a very typical exhibition which you can visit in almost every museum, where you see all the paintings next to each other and it's kind of divided in time periods or something. And it's quite boring to visit this kind of exhibition, though I'm not against these exhibitions, but I walked through it in like quite a fast manner. And then I was thinking, it's certainly necessary, these kind of exhibition, because they're more about a kind of historical narrative that must be told. But at the same time, what if you now would juxtapose these kind of works with other works? And then I think it would all start to live much more, and would become a more interesting experience, to even a kind of mental experience, to visit this kind of exhibition and to really reflect on the paintings that were made. And now it's put in kind of simple narratives. So how to complexify narratives within an exhibition, and there I think strategies of choreography and theatricality might be interesting. Now, about the stillness of a certain work, I don't know how I really have to understand your question, but if you look to an object, I think it is at the same time a passive object, but in its best way, it also makes something active. It makes a kind of reflection process active. And there seems to be this idea that in performance, because it's moving and because it's in process, this is much more at stake or much more the case. Whereas I think that's a kind of simplifying notion of objects against, or the non-material versus the material. I think objects are also constantly alive, and I mean, not necessarily changing on the spot itself, but they are changing over time. Again, if you look to these Modigliani paintings or any painting, when you stand close to them, you see kind of the cracks in the painting, and this already tells a huge story of a kind of history. So they are performing themselves at that point. So yeah, voilà, that's something I wanted to add.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about that in relation to the object is performing its history through its duration in a particular space, and how that is different for each viewer's interaction with the object. But I suppose what I was thinking about in terms of stillness is in relation to the gallery space and the sort of potential for these small gestures or interactions, like with there was a work at Documenta, I was thinking about the carpet, and it's just a bright pink, neon pink carpet when you step through one of the rooms in the space, and how that immediately, in stepping onto that work, which is like in very much contrast to this idea of the live event or the performed artwork, that you kind of enter the space of possibility of performance as a viewer.
But it was a work from a performance artist, right? It was so there would happen performance. I saw it in Documenta with a performance happening on the carpet, but I went back also, and then it was empty, and people were laying there and performing themselves on this carpet. So indeed, sometimes a very simple element, this carpet, or in the work of Hanna Lippert, this kind of other kind of space, a more theatrical space, creates a very different relation to the environment you're in. And that's certainly very interesting to play with, or sounds also, or I think even there's a whole world that is unexplored of using scent within exhibition spaces, which is sometimes used in hotels, and I find it fascinating, but never in exhibition spaces. How can this enhance or make your experience different? Yeah.
I think I was just going to pick up on something which maybe kind of relates a little bit to yours and maybe also to Nicola's, which was around, I guess, the kind of moment, that the performance starts, with a singer that's walking around the fair, like instantly there's like a kind of different relationship in the space. And, there's instantly a kind of audience, performer, and that kind of like instant shift in those moments I find really interesting. And I kind of wanted to ask, kind of particularly maybe Nicola and Maeve around that kind of momentary shift, and is that something you're interested in, and that how someone kind of suddenly becomes audience, and there's an event occurring.
I'm definitely interested in it, I think, and when you were saying about stillness as well, I kind of, for me, it's the same sort of thing when this shift happens, but the idea of being in a space and that kind of, as well as the potential for something else, but the kind of moment of contemplation, or like being able to be in a space and to contemplate. And I think as soon as something kind of moves into action, then that the space for you to contemplate gets shifted, definitely, or squashed slightly. And I think that happens anyway in a gallery, any gallery that you go to, because we go there in a mode that we're looking and listening, and so whatever is happening in the environment is kind of feeding into that experience. And I think the moment of the performance for me, I guess I'm very interested in how the people who are performing deal with that, and how they kind of, because there's a certain element of preservation as well, or they'll do certain things that almost kind of protects them from the eyes and the ears of the audience until the kind of tension, that immediate tension, just sort of dissipates. And so one of the first pieces of work that I made with a pianist, that was exactly about the kind of self-consciousness of being in front of the camera as well, and like having a job to do, playing the piano, but the camera's on you, and how do you deal with that, or how long does it take for you to become so concentrated and ingrained in the thing that you're doing that you just forget about everything else. So I think that's probably more fascinating for me, the point where the audience and the kind of performer alike have no inhibitions, like they're kind of not self-conscious at all, they're just completely at ease with what's going on, and even kind of like rapidly learning and adjusting and changing, if that helps.
Do you want to add anything, Nicola?
Yeah, I will. I hope I'm keeping up with what's happening, so maybe I hope I don't answer a question that's been asked 2 minutes beforehand. But just in terms of this shift, yeah, so in the gallery, so who or what's performing, when you present performance or something related to a performance in the gallery, I think about it as trying to cut through some of the stickiness of visual art spaces sometimes, which can feel quite uptight or quite stuffy, or that there's a really particular way that one is supposed to engage with those spaces. So I use performance to kind of cut through that. And one way I think about that in terms of objects is this idea of an unstable object that's kind of speaking, or that's inviting you to look at it in the way that I feel like I sometimes achieve that kind of energy, is to make things with people, so make things with other performers or participants in workshops, and then they become the artworks. For me, that gives them a kind of extra sense of energy or history or presence that performs some of that in the space. I hope you got that.
Yeah. Do you want to?
No. I was going to also. I just wanted to also pick up on another kind of great phrase with Michael, when you were talking about that some performance that you've seen in galleries could never survive on the stage. And I was actually talking to Mel Broomfield earlier today, and Mel actually wants to kind of go actually work with a kind of theatre kind of professional development stuff, to actually work on scripts and to kind of work with kind of, you know, actors and the kind of actual kind of scope and content that a theatre provides, to actually kind of move into that sphere. But I guess I kind of have like slightly opposing things, in that the one, like, you know, the context of the gallery is a totally different situation, and that the works would probably never survive on the stage because they were never intended to ever kind of be in that kind of environment. And then on the converse, I think, you know, sometimes there's a kind of, well, Maeve and I know someone who has a kind of opinion around art, you know, art rock groups are basically just kind of like very poor kind of poor pop groups that would never survive in pop, and that somehow by bringing it into the gallery is a license to be slightly, you know, not as good as you might be on the stage. Is that something you've kind of, you know, do you think, is it the context, or is it actually just kind of poor performance in a gallery?
Can I add something there as well? Sorry. I just wanted to say that maybe that there's this idea of safety in the gallery audience, or like the contemporary art audience, which you spoke about, Michael, about being, you know, like it's all right because we're an audience and we're used to this and we know how to behave in front of this, so that makes it okay. Whereas if that happens outside of that safe space of the gallery, then you're dealing with very different types of interactions, potentially.
No, I certainly agree that you deal with different social codes, and so the codes of a gallery are very different than the codes of a theatre. nonetheless, I still remain with my point that you see a lot of qualitatively very bad performance art within galleries, which always strikes me. And that even has to do with how people, very simple things like how you speak or understandability, or I don't know, indeed, someone kind of, well, there are many examples, but so it always strikes me that there is this unbalance in quality. But what even strikes me much more is a kind of, and that's on the part of the audience, a kind of bluntly uncriticality towards performance art within galleries. People are very critical towards objects or things that are usually within galleries, but towards performances, people are very kind. Whereas within theatrical setup, whether you're now a visual artist or not at all, or used to work in theaters, it's much more a critical environment towards what you're doing. Now, this discussion, it's more a kind of side discussion. What interests me nowadays much more, and think there are interesting things happening, is the other way around, where visual artists are moving into the theater. Because the best shows I have seen within theater are those from visual artists, because they kind of start anew. They question really these codes of the theaters, which performing artists often take for granted. So a show from Ragnar Kjartansson, which was at the Volksbühne some years ago, that was one of the best tragedies I have seen, because he really understood what it was about within the theater context, because he really did research also to this context. So Germaine Kruip with a possibility of an abstraction, which is a whole piece where you would look to light changes, but it's so well done. So these are, for me, much more interesting cases to talk about necessarily than what is happening in galleries nowadays. Yeah.
So I was just going to respond with one tiny thing. Number one, I think when I was talking with Mel today, we were just talking about the different context of budgets. So like primarily, the ability to do something in the theatre, is you've got like an amazing support staff, and like the budgets, well, in comparison to visual art kind of galleries, where you've got, really kind of bare bones, I think there's a kind of lot of scope. But I totally agree. I think there's something really interesting. And I think it really works when actually it's truly interdisciplinary, and when actually you really actually have to think about all of these, different codes of conduct and, exactly what it is that you're dealing with. If you're kind of engaging with performance, then, you really need to understand that, the kind of the discipline that you're working with, and to be able to critique that. Anyway.
Yeah, I think also, I think with the sort of bad performances as well, I think there's also lots of bad other shows and other things that are out there. And I also think, actually, when I think about myself going to performance art as well, there are a lot of times, I don't know if anyone, there's a lot of times where I see things advertised and I just think, I'm just not going to that, or how it's kind of spoken about, or how it's phrased. And I think everybody's always going to vote with their feet, but I think also, that if it lacks people kind of being critical, that often they don't go in the first place, which probably makes it worse. But
Are there any questions? Would anyone like to ask any questions? Yeah.
Shall I run this one?
Yeah.
More of like just wondering, more of an approach, I guess, about what you were saying, continuing about the lack of like critique within, and the sort of poor performance, and how when you're using with your work, when you bring in actual actresses and musicians like the opera singer, and then the response from the audience, it's easier because it's familiar, because they're used to hearing an opera singer. So even though it's within a performing arts environment, it's very much they're easier to respond to, because it's like, oh, it's an opera singer. I know I can respond to this. Whereas if it's something that's very contemporary in an environment of a gallery, but there's no critique, there's no judgment, there's no response because they don't know how to respond. It's something they've not witnessed or experienced before. And so is it something that we're going to, like you were saying, the split discipline of having actual musicians, actual dancers, are they appreciated perhaps more so or less in that environment? Do you understand what I mean?
I'll say quickly for mine, I think I've used the opera singers knowing that exactly, that they're so sort of commanding, and that everybody is immediately kind of drawn to, like, that
exactly,
opera singer in Brussels, definitely about that, because up until the point where she actually starts singing, she's kind of spouting sort of mad words, and everybody's kind of backing away from her, and then she sings. And so for me, and then using the opera singers with the actress as well, like finding that actress, another thing that I won't research that in depth, like I try to kind of find things, like I stuck in a search for an actress in Manchester who'd played Nina from The Seagull, and she popped up and she was the first person, and so I just, I emailed her, and that was that. So I like to, again, by chance happen upon these people, and then it just see how it works from there. But certainly, and then with the 16 kind of sopranos at the backing, doing the backing chorus, or interrupting her with their chorus, again, I guess I was thinking immediately, like, if this is a video work, or if it becomes a live performance as well, that 16 sopranos in any space, this is where I can start venturing into, or looking for kind of spaces that will really just emphasize that, and kind of. But yeah, certainly from my point of view, I think I was definitely kind of using them because of their skill, and the fact that they couldn't be ignored. It was like picking a material that would do the right thing, really. And
I also thought about the lack of control of the audience that we have sometimes. Obviously, we don't know who's going to come and witness the work, so would they walk away and say, oh, we heard this opera singer, or did we go and see a performance art piece?
And I think that's another thing as well that I do, that with that opera singer being on a timer as well, and the other piece being a kind of a very repetitive thing, like that's so repetitive, it goes on for 20 minutes, that people are sick of it, and the actress is kind of almost crying, but because she hasn't been able to blink for 20 minutes. And so I think, I'm always trying to kind of, like, I suppose, give a flash of something that would hopefully kind of really pull people in, but then do something that makes their response. It's not to make people feel comfortable or feel happy, and it's not to kind of do the opposite of that either, but it's just that it's not always going to be as it seems. And so that opera singer just drifting through, and never, once she'd kind of dropped that song and people had got kind of into it, then she was kind of gone, and that was it. So joy.
Does anyone else want to add anything, or
Sort of following on from thinking about Maeve's work, when you're sourcing your material, essentially, and testing out these ideas, has there ever been a point where the outcome hasn't matched your expectation, or it's not a finished work, if that makes sense? Because whether it's not a performance, it's just a trial.
Well, this tonight is the first time of working in this way, and this is kind of just one strand of a bigger piece of work. I don't think so. I can't think of a point where I've been, like, disappointed with what's happened. And, like, that first piece in the basement space, that was, like, the most enjoyable kind of preview I'd ever been involved with. And the same thing actually doing the piece at the Harris with the opera singers. And I think, but because I suppose I've gotten used to my job, like, is all in the run up to it, and experiencing and seeing these plays, and being at different kind of exhibitions, and I suppose reading just enough but not too much. There's a lot of that goes on. I think I try to just really trust when intuitively I've done it enough, and the kind of parameters for the work seem right. And so far, I can't think of anything that's really fallen flat. And I think again, like, the other lady was saying, but we're using the kind of opera singers. And there was a time when, and I worked with a tenor as well, and just having them in the space, I had to stop myself from being kind of overly excited, just because it's so amazing for me to be in a small space or in the studio with this incredible kind of skill there. But no, again, I think, yes, so far it seems to be that I seem to kind of find the right balance of how much to control it and how much to delve into it and how much just is left to kind of unravel in the moment.
Which I think kind of nicely brings back to, did you want to ask a question? You go. Nicely brings back to this idea of that everyone touched on, of like openness or unfixedness of a work, and that being a really important part of everyone's practice. But I'm going to finish there and just say that the next talk in the series is at the Northern Gallery of Contemporary Art on the 4th of April, and with an invited speaker, Sarah Giannini and George Vaisi, exploring ideas around language and fiction in relation to constructing the exhibition. Thank you very much, everyone.